Several years ago, I decided I wanted a new hobby. I've never been one to be shy about taking on a new hobby. And some of them stick with me for a lifetime, and some of them I put on like a new pair of shoes only to be discarded when they're worn and no longer smell so good. But in this instance, I was attracted to saltwater aquariums. Now, I've always loved the variety of bright colored fish that you could see at the saltwater in saltwater tanks, and I've had freshwater fish when I was a kid, but I thought I'd give it a go with saltwater aquariums. So I started going to aquarium stores, researching the subject, and set out on my new hobby in the world of saltwater tanks. But running a healthy saltwater aquarium is more challenging than a freshwater tank, but I thought I was up for the challenge and I was eager to learn. So I followed all the best advice I could in setting up the tank. I purchased the tank from a reputable store that was local to my area that specialized in saltwater tanks. I got all the chemicals and the salt balance right in the tank. I got the water tested, let the tank mature for several days before adding any fish to it, and then I started to slowly introduce fish into the aquarium following the advice of my local shop. Now, if you've never done saltwater tanks before, the saltwater fish are more expensive than your run-of-the-mill goldfish that you'll find at Petco or something. Some of them are very expensive, but I started on the cheaper end of saltwater fish in the $20 to $40 range, which was still expensive for me. But these fish were supposed to be hardy and supposed to be good starter fish. So I'd introduce a nice-looking fish, carefully selected from the local store. A few days later, I'd find that fish floating upside down in the aquarium. So I'd test the water, I'd ask questions, and I'd figure out what was going wrong. I even took the water from my tank in to have it tested at the local store. Everything tested okay, so I'd buy another fish only to have the same result a few days or a week or two later. So I began to wonder if my local store had a racket running because he'd tell me the water was just fine, and then he'd turn around and sell me another $20 or $40 fish to go sacrifice in my tank. So I went to another store that specialized in saltwater tanks, and I asked some questions, and I got some different answers to some of the questions. So it was a racket. I was starting to get caught on here. So I went to a third store. I asked some questions, and I got a different set of advice. Each time the owner was adamant that you should never do this or that, only to go to the next store where they'd say you always want to do this or that. Every store had a different method, and some warned against taking the advice that I was previously given. In the end, I figured out that I was the fish on the hook, and after sinking several $100s and several months on my new hobby and realizing it was a lot of work to boot, I got out of the saltwater fish business. Now, if I want to see a colorful fish, I go to a professional aquarium and I admire the fish that they keep. In fact, when I see such an aquarium, I can often point and say, yeah, I remember when I had that fish for a week, or I remember when I killed that fish. You know, it's kind of this morbid walk down memory lane for me to look at a saltwater aquarium these days. But out of this experience came a saying that I still use today, and that saying is like raising saltwater fish. Anytime I say that, my wife knows exactly what I mean. So what that means is you can go from one expert to the next and you'll get different advice from each. Now, I'm convinced in some cases that the different techniques worked for both experts. They just had different ways of achieving the same goal. In some ways, riding a motorcycle is like raising saltwater fish. Now, don't get me wrong, just like raising saltwater fish, there is some tried and true advice that always holds true. You know, in the aquarium world, you want to do partial water changes on a healthy tank. You never change all of the water at once. In saltwater tanks, some of the fish don't get along with others. There are prey and predator fish. I once saw one of my fish eat a $50 fish just minutes after being introduced into the tank. The one that ate the $50 fish was cheaper than the one he ate. But when it comes to motorcycles, there are some things that will always be true. The motorcycle will go where you look. Target fixation is a bad habit. Following distance will buy you time and safety. And drinking alcohol and riding is a recipe for disaster. Those are motorcycle facts, but there are some things that I recommend on this channel, and you'll see another instructor on a different channel that's telling you something different. It's like raising saltwater fish. Your goal as a student of motorcycling is to understand what are facts and what are technique, and that there may be more than one technique to achieve the same goal. You won't hear a whole lot of instructors say this, but my technique in some aspects of riding may be different than another instructor's technique, and we both may be right. Your job as a rider is to find the technique that works for you and develop it while avoiding the advice that goes against riding facts or best advice. And sometimes that's not an easy task, just as I found in raising saltwater fish. But any motorcycle instructor who thinks they have a market cornered on motorcycle facts and that their way is the only way to do it needs to go out and buy a saltwater tank. When exploring a technique, ask yourself these questions. Does this technique put me at extra risk? Does this technique go against generally accepted professional advice from trained instructors? Does this technique work for me and help me achieve my goal? Or can I make adjustments to a technique that fit me better while still keeping me safe? I used to have some riders doing the U-turn in a new rider class with the wrong technique. They were comfortable performing the U-turn within the box without the clutch, and they'd really lean that motorcycle way over to get around through there and perform the U-turn within the confines of a box, albeit on a 250cc motorcycle. So I'd tell these riders, perform that U-turn using the correct technique taught in class. That's clutching the friction zone, dragging the rear brake, turning your head, and counterweighting. Because I knew something that new rider didn't know. I knew when they got on a larger motorcycle or the traction was reduced, using the technique taught by the MSF would be hugely beneficial to them. So I always encourage them to perform the task using the proper technique. So my advice to you as a rider is to do your homework, learn to separate facts from advice, and find the techniques that help you perform the task of riding a motorcycle at the highest level of personal safety and comfort to you. Till next week, guys, it's Kevin with MCrider, and I'll see you on the road.